Hello, everyone. Welcome to Labocine Live. My name is Alexi Gambis. I'm the artistic director of the platform and also of the accompanying festival called the Imagine Science Film Festival that is now in its 14th year. And as part of our live series and also in connection with our monthly issue, the April issue that we have on Labocine now, which is called Being an Island, we organize events, screenings, and discussions. And we're extremely excited to have with us today Anthony Banua-Simon, who's going to come and speak to us a little bit about his wonderful film Cane Fire. But before we introduce Anthony, I wanted to give our audience a little bit of a background on our platform. Our platform is a platform that tries to celebrate science in many different ways in cinema, whether it's documentary, fiction, animation, also lab footage. And we often refer to ourselves as kind of proponents of the science new wave, which means that we want to redefine how science is incorporated into film. And we're really interested in films that seamlessly do that, where the science is maybe not necessarily at the forefront, but it's very much kind of integrated into the stories of places and people. And definitely Cane Fire fits into that. And so we're super excited to have you today, Anthony. Um, yeah, I was wondering, Anthony, if we could begin. So I should mention that your film is going to be on the platform on the 29th and 30th. We're super lucky to be able to screen it. And I'm sure you've been invited. I kind of always start um, these kind of conversations you know, by asking you a little bit about your kind of relationship to kind of scientific topics, um, and I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit about that, and maybe before that, introduce yourself and tell us, yeah, a little bit about yourself and where you're situated in these strange times that we're living in.
Uh, well, thank you for having me, Alexi, and yeah, I'm really excited to have the film invited. Um, yeah, I was first drawn to this topic, I guess, through a collaborative documentary I would call collaborative studio called Union Docs in Brooklyn, New York. And it's where I met Mike Vass, who's the co-writer and co-producer of Cane Fire. We collaborated on a short documentary about the Domino Sugar Factory, which is located in Brooklyn, New York, what's Williamsburg specifically. And we in the residency that we were at Union Docs, it was making short documentaries about this 2 mile radius known as Lassuris. And we saw this cavernous brick building that just overshadowed Williamsburg on the waterfront, and we were so curious about it and learning more about it. And um, through talking to residents in the neighborhood, there was a lot of former workers that were 2 blocks away from where they worked for many years. And the refinery closed down in 2004, but it had been from its start this major place for refining sugar that was being extracted. But the raw product was bringing from the Caribbean, from Puerto Rico and other islands, to be refined. And we were learning more about or researching more about the history of sugar production and of this massive enterprise that went across the world. And at the same time, learning about the workers' experience, that they were part of a very strong union that went on some very long, I think the longest strike in New York's history, about 2 years, fighting for a living wage in New York. And, it was learning about that, the labor history of this industrial work on the waterfront, And then after the sugar refinery closed down in 2004, immediately flipped from being zoned as an industrial space to luxury real estate immediately. So it was kind of this immediate flip from a kind of a hyper gentrification where it wasn't a slow movement, slow growth of New York. It was like complete displacement overnight. And
I remember also that it was, it was the closing of the sugar factory, and then there was also this kind of limbo period where it was also like a place that you could visit, right? There was almost like a limbo period before it actually became this luxury housing. Like people would actually, I mean, I remember back in the days, people would be like, oh, let's go visit this kind of like vestigial like
yeah,
relic, as you were saying, it was like a very kind of impressive, iconic, yeah, structure that kind of floated in the horizon there from Williamsburg.
yeah. I mean, that was kind of my introduction to the building itself. A friend used to would go into the building and we would explore it, and it was just this cavernous, it felt like this post-apocalyptic sci-fi set because it was all this machinery with brown sugar like encased everything. Like it was so obscure what it would have looked like originally. I think that's what drew Mike and I, is like we wanted to find former workers to explain like what was this, how did this giant facility function. And so we actually took a lot of footage inside of the refinery and then would show it. It's Johnny and Johnny Mendez and Frank, and he would they would look at it and like, oh yeah, we did, the sugar would be brought up through here and then through these chutes and then boiled here, and it all kind of made sense. But yeah, so it was looking at that, and then knowing that like I had family in Hawaii and Kauaʻi specifically that had a connection to the sugar production, but it was kind of obscure. It was hard to wrap my head around exactly how it worked.
Mm-hmm.
It was something that when I was a child visiting there, most of the refineries, there were no refineries. The refineries were in California. The mills where the sugar was transported were mostly closed down, and so it was something that was a little distant at that point. And so, but doing this film with Domino Sugar, I was going through the sugar history and understanding, oh, this is why my great grandmother from Puerto Rico traveled all the way to Hawaii, where she was working in extracting sugar or in the fields. And because of a hurricane that destroyed the fields, the I guess the sugar barons at the time coordinated this migration all the way from Puerto Rico to Hawaii to work in other sugar fields. And so,
I'm fascinated by that because to one end, so you're a filmmaker living in New York, kind of witnessing the demise of this like domino factory and kind of your connection to kind of the sugar history, and then that kind of brings you back to understanding your own lineage, right? Like how some of your family from Puerto Rico arrived to Hawaii, and I believe like that part also was from the Philippines, right? That were
yes,
and so it's this really amazing journey where like kind of the sugar, and also because sugar is also being processed, right, in these different places, and
right.
you have the mills, you have the refineries that and on one end you have kind of like the processing the sugar, but that also kind of led you to understand a little bit of your own kind of migration route and your own history, right?
Yeah, I think that was was very significant was the U.S. annexed Puerto Rico 1898 and Hawaii at the same years, and so this migration was actually coordinated by the first U.S. instated governor of Puerto Rico, who went on to be the president of Domino Sugar. Like he was already making these associations and deals, and when he went on to become, after he was the governor, had already had these business relationships in order to keep the refinery going. And so yeah, and so looking at starting in Hawaii, it was following my great uncle Henry, and who had worked in all these very particular industries in Hawaii over the years, starting in sugar and pineapple as a truck driver, helping out as a crew member on these Hollywood sets, and then going even further back to my great grandfather, who arrived from the Philippines to work in the pineapple industry, was a union activist, was fighting for a living wage in these really dire circumstances, living on plantation camps, really insular. It really started there. And then, yeah, looking at the sugar industry, it was completely extractive. You look at, this indigenous population, Native Hawaiians, had a perfect system for looking at the island of a self-sufficient way of living on an island, the Ahapua system of from the mountain to the stream, sections of land where, the water would run down from the mountains. It would go through these fish ponds. It would irrigate the taro fields, everything. They had it completely worked out, and the sugar companies came through and just, completely chopped up the land, rerouted irrigation canals, and it's really, it has not gone back. That those irrigation canals are still there, and unfortunately, in the film I talk about how the sugar owners moved into real estate, setting up hotels, but an unfortunate side as well is for any sort of commercial agriculture that happens in Hawaii is associated with the biotech industry. So we're looking at Monsanto, Dow, DuPont, Pioneer. And so they're actually using this whatever layout of these irrigation canals, natural water that was set up in the sugar industry for these like large commercial companies. And
wow, so they're kind of repurposing the same structures, but using it for, in this case, for like the biotech and these companies.
Yeah, exactly.
But so Anthony, I'm curious about one thing of it. So yeah, first of all, an unbelievable film in terms of also its structure, which is so it feels so organic, and at the same time there are so many elements to the piece, which is very kind of mind-blowing, because it almost feels that the focal point is is the island, right? And at the same time you're kind of tracking the evolution of this island through time, but there are many different elements, right? There's the incorporation of archival footage, also about like representation of the islands through through Hollywood and through these kind of major iconic figures, like Charlton Heston, Elvis Presley, and then there's also kind of the personal narrative, your relationship to the island. There's the agricultural aspect, the real estate. There are so many elements, and I was wondering, when you were set off to do this project, how did you think about it in terms of structure? What were kind of like the constant things saying like, okay, this is what I'm trying to gravitate around? I mean, was it the concept of the island that kind of helped you contain everything? But I'm just curious how you put it all together, or what was kind of the process behind that?
Yeah, I think that it started rather small. Coming from the Domino Sugar and project, and just looking at the sugar history, being talking with my great uncle, and you know, also thinking about my childhood associations with the island when I would visit as a kid, my draw to this Hollywood history, and then and it was almost kind of like uh, I guess questioning, what was the appeal of me, like of these films that drew me so much, and why did I think that my family would be connected to it, or if my family wasn't connected to these films, who on the island is conscious of this? Was a question that I asked people. And I felt like uh, feeling like an outsider visiting family, and it felt like working through these films would be a good place to start as this parallel history next to this material history of the island, how they comment on one another and how they don't. And I think that you know there when you uh, it's hard to wrap your head around um, how much uh, the the big five, the sugar owners shifting to the United States, um, what there's so much that they did materially on the island to dominate the space. I thought that that they were involved in the message of these Hollywood films was a good way filmically to examine this, because that they were conscious of the message and what they wanted to portray, and maybe they weren't in complete control of it, but it was a concentrated effort, and that was interesting to me. They that some of the films are advertising Kauai as this exotic South Seas fantasy as PR for the sugar companies, or to build tourism and build the idea of statehood when it came to the U.S. But it felt like there was so much there, and we were willing to, if it wasn't working, we were willing to let it go, but it just kept building, and people on the island kept commenting on it, and it felt it got to the point where they seemed to really be um, in this parallel line. And I think that doing so much research, and I've interviewed so many people, that kept this record of oral history of so many different perspectives, it got to the point where it kind of kept these threads in my head of looking at sovereignty, looking at the labor movement, looking at the real estate boom, and then also looking at you know so we came out of this period of large Hollywood productions that had these specific ideologies, and now we're looking at people today that are user created YouTube videos that are reflecting these myths. They're playing them back, and they might not be aware of it, and like, how do they see themselves in relation to Hawaii?
But what's fascinating about those representations, is that what I got out of it is that, of course, there's a critical view on it, right? Because these are representations that kind of aggravate stereotypes, but there's also kind of like a somewhat of a nostalgia of those times, right? That they're like, oh, I remember having met Elvis Presley. Oh, who was that guy? Oh yeah, Charlton Heston. So
Mhm.
there's also kind of like an emotional kind of attachment to that, and I thought that was really beautiful, where it's not just like, one reading of the film can be, okay, these Hollywood films were coming and exploiting, but it seems like it was also kind of, part of the fabric, and people were kind of willing to also be part of these. It's just very complex, right? That there, as much as it's oversimplistic and kind of showing an image of Hawaii and the islands there, is there's also kind of a sense of attachment to that. Yeah.
Oh, totally. Yeah, the conflicted nostalgia is something that would come up a lot, and it's because it's something that it's part of the history. And I think that was the approach when we would use these Hollywood films, is we wouldn't keep it like pushed away as this like archival source. We wanted to kind of play with its original thrust, you know, and it's tricky because you can go too far and be, you know,
Yeah.
overly taken by it. But you know, it's kind of this obscene history that is part of it, you know, and it's it doesn't really benefit anyone, I think, to block it out completely. I mean, even uh, but address it, talk about it, how it makes you feel, what do you like, what you don't like. Like Keala, the Native Hawaiian activist, she talks about this, not in the film, you know, about, you know, these beautiful images. I mean, it's hard to deny a 35 millimeter, you know, sunset of in South
Right.
Pacific. It's like evocative, it's seductive, and dealing with that, working through that, that I think that's the idea, or kind of the thrust of this archive based work, is acknowledging the core material and reworking it, but not denying where, you know, the connotations it carries with it.
Yeah, because I feel like when you repurpose that type of footage, you can, yeah, it's like a double-edged sword, right? You can really you can use it in ways that kind of manipulate the footage, but it feels to me that you pay tribute to it, but you also kind of critique it to some extent. I wanted to ask you, Anthony, which is something that appeared like towards the beginning of the film, which is, you know, you obviously did you ever live in the islands, or you just went to visit, right? It was
Yeah,
just kind of
just in
visiting
business.
cousins. So, you know, and I remember there was like an early scene where like somebody kind of comes with their Jeep and says like, "Who are you?" And then, you know, they see, I think, your uncle.
Yeah.
But I was wondering, you know, how was it for you to go back? You know, what you had gone there, and of course you have memories and of being in the islands when you were young. But I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that reception as a filmmaker, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like coming back, obviously not being completely foreign because you're connected to the place, but also being a bit of an outsider, kind of in between those states. But now you're coming back as like as a filmmaker, right? And you know everybody's primed about, you know, about like cameras being there. And I was just wondering like how was that in terms of getting people's trust and explaining to people what you were aiming to do, and also even to your own family, explaining
Mm-hmm.
like what, you know, because I'm assuming that they may have been asking like, oh, but what exactly are you making, like what is it about, or you know, these types of questions.
Yeah, that's a long, it depends on who I'm talking to, but to
Yeah.
start with, the my uncle, when we were at the he's showing me around the sugar mill, you know, we sneak through, and I wanted to have that scene to kind of set up this outsider relationship, that the security guard comes and he says he's not going to get in trouble, you're going to get in
You
trouble.
are. Yeah.
Yeah,
You actually put that early in the film to state that that is
exactly.
something that like it's almost like a disclaimer, you know.
Yeah. When it came to, I think everyone I talked to, it was, I always shared exactly like what my vision was, and you know, I think with my cousins, with my great uncle Henry, they were came out of these organic conversations that, you know, these are things that they were that are on their mind, rather than me kind of having my own vision and then grabbing kind of talking points that fit the vision. I would
Right.
always just kind of share, just because I just was extremely curious, and I think they appreciated that. I mean, my great uncle Henry appreciated that I would learn about these things, and you know, we developed a rapport from that, and you know, I don't think I would have featured them if we were in disagreement in the overall message and the politics. When it came to other people in the film, you know, that I felt, you know, like the sugar plantation descendant, or the real estate agent, you know, board of realtors, I was also explaining to them to what my vision was, and I don't know if they quite understood, and they just kind of, with the real estate agent, if he had his own vision of what it was. But, I was less conscious, I guess, I felt like looking at this power structure, I felt like people that had less power to represent themselves, that I should be extremely conscious and work with them to make sure that this is something that they agree to, and that they're being represented clearly. When it came to people that I thought had more power over my family and people in Hawaii, I was kind of like, I just, I didn't want to, some of the more uncomfortable conversations that you see wasn't about shaming an individual, or it was more kind of indicative of, I thought, of like larger forces. So that was that dynamic. With the Native Hawaiian activists, I thought was completely different, because it was capturing something, an action, a restoration, an activist action. And their time was, they're in the process of doing something. They're not reflecting on something that happened in the past. And so I felt like there had to be more of an exchange that, with Keala, who you see featured, when we first met, we just talked for a good 2 hours about just everything, like every strange association. And she was extremely receptive to it. But knowing that, their story fits into my film, but it's not a complete advocacy piece. I'm going to have my own point of view. And so I think what we came up with was, because their style was like to get their message across, and to get, and so our agreement was that, I would use the footage for my film, but then I would also give them the footage for whatever they wanted to create,
Oh,
because
that's amazing.
yeah, it's they had other things that are important to them, and other talking points that weren't as significant to me. And it wasn't, they weren't opposed to one another. They weren't like ideologically, but things that were more significant to them. Unfortunately, as you see, the whole thing was disbanded, and I wasn't actually able to see that through, and I don't know what it would have looked like, but it felt like a worthwhile experiment, or it felt like a fair trade, and I think everyone was comfortable with that. But yeah, I think that was that was the relationship, I think, with the footage.
And it seems that, I mean, the making of this film, this is your first like feature length documentary.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, what an amazing debut. It feels like it was like a trip down memory lane, right? Because it's like all of these elements are like, even the archives are kind of probably memories of films that that you saw when you were growing up.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just curious how that's kind of changed your relationship to Hawaii. Like, yeah, how has the film kind of impacted you in terms of your connection to to home? Because obviously, I mean, I guess you're, as many, I mean, I can relate as well. We all have kind of very nomadic, we've migrated, we live in different places, but I'm just kind of curious on how that's kind of, yeah, what that experience has been for you in terms of your relationship to Hawaii.
Yeah, I think that it was definitely an education, because it was, like I said, starting small. And I have to be honest that there was a bit of ignorance of, I was so excited and about researching the labor history of um, the Asian immigrant population that organized with the ILWU, and there was a pride in that, and coming off of the Domino Sugar Project about union activity, and that they really achieved this level of security by organizing. And it created a middle class for a period of time. but then having to be conscious and honest that this was working within the idea of land ownership in statehood, and you have a sovereign community that has a different relationship to the land, and needing to be really honor that, and honor the tension of that, that there's some people, that there's settlers to Hawaii, whether it's immigrant settlers or not. You know, it's important. I think I came out of this being very clear that there should be an allyship with Native Hawaiian sovereignty movement,
Mm.
and they have to be in control of this next stage.
Mm.
That was something that was obscure to me. It was kind of working through this history, because it was something that was not, it's just not something you hear in the forefront. And it's something that I'm more conscious of looking, okay, what's the, what is, how to draw these connections, as coalition that's hinted at in history, looking at what I show in the film with the Hawaiian sovereignty movement, of the Hawaiian Renaissance, they call it, of like, outward activism with tenants' rights and communities, and different housing districts, and then Mauna Kea today. But that was probably the biggest education for me. I mean, among other things, but yeah, that was probably the biggest.
I think that's what I mean. What fascinated me was that kind of depiction of Hawaii, and like the plurality of it, right? Like the many different kind of perspectives and communities, and of course you have the Native Hawaiian community, you have kind of the people that have migrated there, and you have it's interesting because you oftentimes see Hawaii in almost like a very kind of in a very kind of representational, almost like stagnant kind of depiction of like how people perceive maybe Hawaii from outside.
Right.
Here you're almost like, it's almost like a dissection, right? Like you're going in there with like a scalpel, and there are all these layers, and I feel like it's not only showing you that plurality, but also like over time, right? Kind of like
Right.
this kind of like evolution of an island that somehow has remained unified despite all of these kind of exterior influences that have happened. So I think it's really, really amazing. What has the experience been for you in terms of showing the film there? I mean, I know you showed it at the Hawaii Film Festival, and I know that we're like in the middle of a pandemic, not to forget. but but yeah, curious if you've, yeah, what the reception has been. It's never super pleasant also to have to kind of engage with any like biotechs, or those types of people are always kind of a little bit. I've had my own fair share of issues with Monsanto and those people, but I'm just curious about yeah, how that's been.
Yeah, I was, of all the canceled festival, not canceled, but not being able to go in person, I think the Hawaii Festival was just really heartbreaking that I wasn't able to travel with the film.
Yeah.
I'm getting a lot of great reception from people online, but I miss that energy you feel being in a theater, and maybe someone coming up to me afterwards, or talking, that might not feel comfortable articulating themselves online or another, or someone just that visceral response you get from an audience. I'm missing. I've gotten a lot of great feedback from people based in Hawaii, but I think the most you get online is, I have someone that's from academia or film community,
Right.
other artists, but what about
The community, yeah.
the community, how to reach, and that's a little bit frustrated and I'm not able to, other than my family and their friends, which was encouraging. But
Yeah.
I think
Well,
beyond
you'll have that at some point, I'm sure.
eventually, yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
And so what's the next steps? Yeah, I'm curious a little to know a little bit more about you as a filmmaker. Like where are you? Yeah, what's I mean, apart from bringing this film out to the world, and it's it's been doing amazingly kind of in the festival world. Yeah, what are you type? What's the next project that you're tackling? And I'm always interested in hearing from, I feel like documentary filmmakers is such a vast group to just like put people in. And
Mm.
I was just interested, especially since this is your debut and it also kind of connects to like a personal story. If you're kind of like in that mindset of saying like, oh, I want to kind of dive deeper into kind of things that connect to my own past or my own personal life, or I want to kind of separate myself more from that. And yeah, just in general, what your next evolutionary step is in your own work.
Yeah, I guess I have both um, feelings of there are some projects I'm like, oh yeah, that this did benefit from being very personal. And then other projects where like, well, I'd like to kind of keep, you know, a little more of a distance and not center myself or put myself in the center of the story. It depends, I think, by project. Like I, when I set out for this film, it was, I think, I think the topic or the interest dictates the style eventually. And then I didn't even want to put myself too much in the story in the earliest versions of it. I think that's a lot of people's.
Right.
uh,
Right.
it's
Expectation.
always like, and then it's like, then it becomes something's missing, and then like when you put that part, and then people say, "Oh, now I get." Like it was that kind of process with Cane Fire, where it was like there's something not quite connecting, and then if it benefited the film, then I would do it. Um, but it wasn't like my first thought.
Well, I
Uh,
think what it does is that it kind of also explains the investigative, like the need to kind of dig deeper. I mean, I
yeah,
think the fact that we understand that this is connected to you and that it connects to your past, I feel that like these little glimpses of learning about you and how you would visit, and also how your family, how your parents met, and also even the man saying like, you're going to be in trouble but not him. All
right.
of that already sets a tone of, okay, this is a survey, a historical kind of glimpse into what's happening, but it's told through,
Yeah.
through your story.
Yeah, looking at it now, I mean, I think it's essential to appealing to other people, because being very clear at the front, like this is where I come from, this is my perspective, so people can situate themselves like, oh, okay, I get what his interests are and what his, rather than being this kind of force as if I'm just like a journalistic, this is a journalistic approach. It's not, it's, and I think that was also another stage of the personal film, is like being really honest about what is most interesting to me, rather than, because that's what's going to carry it through at the end. And when things aren't working out, is like, what is the thing that really drives it? Because that's what's going to make it most convincing. I think that was hard to, because it was my first feature, to be really confident with my voice and not be self-conscious about what my interests are. In the beginning, I talked about this, like, uh, only child, not saying all only children are awkward, but this kind of emotionally stunted way of being like, well, I can't relate with my cousins, so I'm gonna, pull from this film, as a conversation starter. And that, that really didn't change so much as an adult, because it's like with my family, I was like, I don't, I don't connect in some ways that other people do. And so I did it through history and their history, and my interest in that was the starting conversation, and then became where we went from there. So that's really what drove it.
Mm. Can you tell me a little bit about the title of the film, Cane Fire? And
Yeah.
how that came about? Because I'm fascinated by the title as well.
When I was learning about just how sugarcane was cultivated, so you have um, vast fields that has the sugar plant, and they need to get to the stalk itself that has the sugar. And so the companies and the workers would start controlled fires of the fields to burn off the extra leaves so that all is left is the
Wow.
stalk. And it's this kind of controlled chaos because it's necessary to the production, but it's this volatile element that the companies are trying to control, and it can get out of control and burn the field down. And so I saw it as this kind of metaphor of this struggle of all these elements on the island. It's kind of as I say in the film, is at a breaking point. It's these unsustainable things that are something is going to knock it out of place, whether it's we had a million predictions of what that would be. COVID wasn't one of them, but it was something that did rattle just this really fragile system of this island that cannot actually, it's not so self-sustainable. It's 90% of all the food and goods are imported to the islands. It's and so it was that with looking at the original Cane Fire film that
right, exactly.
Where a worker deliberately starts an out of control cane fire and burns it all to the ground. And it was really that.
And it seems that as much as like sugar was kind of like a starting point for the film, and kind of ultimately, despite you kind of going into these different directions, it remains that metaphor of the island, right? That the way in which we cultivate, and the sugar production is a great metaphor to kind of thinking about that island. And
totally, yeah. Looking at we always made a joke about the Hollywood film comparison to sugar production, because you have sugar, you have the raw product that's extracted from the island and then refined in California. You think about all the Hollywood productions came to get to have Hawaii was a backdrop for all these ideas of of the military, if they wanted to stage a conflict from World War II in the South Pacific. All these things all these ideologies they got, and then they edited them in California. in
that is kind of amazing that they came there, they kind of cultivated it, and then they kind of just extracted it and brought it into their refineries in Hollywood.
Yeah, it's very that's one of the things. It's actually very rare that there's an actual post-production facility that finishes a film in Hawaii. So many TV shows are shot there, but
and now we can almost think of hopefully there's a better future, but our cinemas are like the domino factories, kind of like just sitting there waiting to be turned into luxury homes, or hopefully to reopen as cafes / open, whatever they do to keep art houses open these days. Well, Anthony, it was a pleasure speaking to you. We're super excited to show the film, and please keep us updated on the next projects that you're doing, and I hope to see you at the festival. And thanks for having. And just to remind everybody, the film will be 29th and 30th. Will be featured as part of the Labocine live series, and beautifully kind of closes actually our our issue on islands, because we started that earlier this month. So I invite everybody also to kind of explore all of these films that we have from around the world on islands. Thank you so much, Anthony.